Hello, I'm Brenda Sherman, and I am going to be talking with you today about using PBIS in alternative settings. We have two other people helping with this webinar. Catherine Claypack is my newly graduated former graduate assistant, and she's going to be monitoring the chat or the questions if you have questions. And we have Anthony, who is helping with all things technology related. You can see a screen on your poll, or on a poll on your screen. And so I see you're answering those questions about, do you have any experience in or work in an alternative setting? And if so, what type? So while you're finishing responding to the poll, I will tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of special education at Texas State University. I'm also a partner with the National PBIS Technical Assistance Center. My role with the Technical Assistance Center is representing alternative education, doing outreach to support PBIS in alternative settings, and providing training and technical assistance to help anyone who's interested or who is actively implementing PBIS in alternative settings. So we'll talk about some of the resources that we have available through the center as we go through this today's talk. So our objectives for today, we're going to start with a quick overview of PBIS, just so we're all sort of on the same page about the concepts that we're talking about. We'll talk about the modifications or adaptations that may be needed for PBIS in alternative settings and how you might accomplish those. I'll show you locations for resources. And then tacked on to the end, because it's an alternative application of PBIS, I'll be talking about PBIS, using a PBIS framework to integrate school police officers into school climate and safety planning. So we'll spend a few minutes on discussing a grant that we're finishing up right now in which we did exactly that. So during our webinar, if you will, think about the content as it applies to your setting. If you have any questions or need clarification on anything, if you would put your comments in the chat or the question and answer. Catherine's going to be monitoring those, and if there's anything that we need to respond to quickly, she'll cut in and let us know. Otherwise, we'll also have time for questions and answers at the end of our discussion. So it looks like the majority of participants who have responded to the poll so far work in an alternative disciplinary day school, okay? But then we've got a nice sampling from other types of alternative settings, such as mental health day schools, juvenile justice day schools, some residential program representatives here. That's not surprising because there's a wide range of alternative programs. And then some people think you might be working with alternative programs in the future. So this is great. This is a great sampling of all the kinds of alternative programs that I work with as in my role with the center. So I'm glad you're able to join us. Okay. Let's see. Anthony, can you stop the poll now? I'm going to move on. Okay, there we go. So let's just start off with a quick review of the basic concepts about PBIS so that we're all on the same page. You know that PBIS is a framework. It specifies critical elements, but it allows local teams to design each element so that the elements are reflective of local needs and priorities and values and program culture. That's especially important in alternative programs. The framework organizes data, systems, and practices, and those components are no different in alternative settings. There may be some adaptations to each of those components, but the same components are critical. And across all of those components, we're always looking for and striving for equity in our practices. We're using science-based, evidence-based practices that still reflect our local values and needs and priorities. Many of you are well familiar with this triangle. The data, systems, and practices of PBIS are also organized across tiers of support because not all youth have the same level of need when it comes to support. It's easy to think in alternative settings that all of the youth that we work with in alternative settings require Tier 3 support, that they need the most intensive, most individualized supports. And I suppose to a certain extent that is true, especially if you're comparing the youth that we serve in alternative programs to youth in typical settings. However, even in the most restrictive, most alternative of alternative settings, we find that the tiered approach is still valid. That if we emphasize Tier 1, we still meet the needs of most of the youth in that setting. Some youth will still need Tier 2 supports, and a few will still need our most intensive, most individualized, most long-term supports. But if we do a really good job implementing Tier 1 and possibly Tier 2 with Fidelity, fewer youth will actually need Tier 3. So the same concept of tiered supports applies, and it's well worth the time and effort to focus on systems level first. So let's talk about, in this section, when I talk about a system-wide, I'm talking about why should we consider alternative programs in a district-wide or a county-wide approach to PBIS? Well, because what I often find is that districts will initiate a PBIS initiative, and they'll get all their elementary schools and middle schools or junior highs and high schools on board, but not the alternative schools or not the juvenile justice programs in their county or other types of alternative settings. So we know that schools, have disciplinary actions that they apply when children misbehave. If children misbehave enough, or if they exhibit certain kinds of misbehavior, then they may be placed in an alternative school, short-term or long-term. Some of those alternative schools are for disciplinary purposes because a student exhibited certain kinds of misbehavior in their typical school. And they go to the alternative school for a period of time. Sometimes the nature of the behavior in school or out of school results in children being placed in and served by a juvenile justice program or a program that is in the mental health system. Those may be day schools, those may be residential schools, they may be at the county level where they serve students from a particular county, or they may be state level where they serve children from all over the state. Juvenile justice programs tend to be primarily for children about ages 13 or 14 and up. They can be younger, that depends largely on states. Mental health programs serve children of all ages. So the children that we're talking about, the children who are placed in alternative day schools or in juvenile justice or mental health programs, these youth tend to move back and forth through this continuum pretty frequently and pretty consistently through their school career. The extent to which we have PBIS in place in all points along this continuum will benefit transition and will just make for a more consistent educational experience for those students. While our data for PBIS in alternative settings is still emerging, we don't have as much impact data in alternative settings. This is a newer extension of PBIS. We still know that positive outcomes are feasible based on the data that we have gathered. We know that it can lead, using PBIS can lead to increased youth engagement in programming, like increased participation in school or better progress through treatment programs. PBIS can lead to reductions in youth disciplinary incidents, both major incidents and minor incidents. Staff tend to like PBIS. They say it gives them more day-to-day tools for interacting with youth, particularly around misbehavior. Staff say that PBIS creates a culture focused on teaching and attending to positive behavior, which is something that they were not doing prior to PBIS. And as I said, staff tend to like PBIS. They view it as manageable, as feasible, as part of their daily activities. And youth also like PBIS. PBIS is being implemented in typical schools, well over 24,000 typical schools around the country. We don't have a precise count for how many alternative schools or entire districts are using PBIS for lots of reasons. But what I know for a fact is that we are implementing PBIS in all types of alternative programs. And the states listed here have various degrees of PBIS implementation in alternative programs around their state. And I put West Virginia at the top of this list because, to my knowledge, West Virginia is one of the states that is really focusing on integrating PBIS throughout all of their alternative programs. If you do a Google search for West Virginia Department of Education, Office of Diversion and Transition, it'll take you, you'll find this homepage that describes juvenile justice in West Virginia, or I'm sorry, PBIS in West Virginia's alternative programs. They provide a link to little descriptions about the core components of PBIS in those alternative programs. And then they provide maps showing where PBIS is being implemented in alternative programs around the state and the types of alternative programs where PBIS is being implemented. By the way, we are also implementing PBIS in very few, but a few adult correctional systems, youth programs in adult correctional systems. Okay, so now let's talk about the modifications that you might need in the practices, systems, and data that you implement when pursuing PBIS in alternative settings. We don't have time to talk about every component and the issues that you might face and how those issues can be addressed in alternative programs. So these are on this screen. You'll see recognize the essential features for Tier 1 practices. These essential features are applicable in alternative programs as well. And the ones that have a green arrow next to them, we're going to talk about, and I'll show you some examples of adaptations and just talk about some of the issues that you might encounter. The rest of these, and especially environmental enhancements and consistency in responses to rule violations, I just want to make a couple of comments now. Juvenile justice programs in particular, but to a certain extent, all alternative programs, especially those that are focused on discipline purposes, are often need what I call environmental enhancements. These are often somewhat environmentally barren environments where there's not much to do. There's not many things on the walls, sometimes for security reasons. They're just not they don't look like places where we serve children. And so one of the aspects of PBIS that I encourage you to consider as you're moving through your planning is how can we make the physical environment more developmentally appropriate for the children who are there. And I use the term children to refer to young children as well as adolescents. Now, in juvenile justice programs, those environmental enhancements, you may have to get creative with that because there are a lot of security regulations, like not posting things on walls. There are always ways to be creative and address the problem of enhancing the challenge of enhancing the environment while still operating with the security constraints of the program. And in terms of consistency and responses to rule violations, again, especially in juvenile justice programs, to a certain extent in disciplinary alternative programs, they're pretty good at consistency and responses to major rule violations. There's less consistency in my experience with how they respond to minor rule violations. That's going to be an important part of your PBIS work, is to, of course, define what constitutes major rule violations versus minor rule violations, and teaching staff strategies for responding to minor rule violations that can be handled in the moment or in the immediate setting. So a lot of times staff are not familiar with strategies that they can use. So that may fall to the PBIS leadership team to explore that and identify strategies that are manageable for staff in those settings. Okay, so let's move on and look at some of the expectations as we that you might, or some of the issues that you might encounter as you're going through these core features. So of course, one of the basic core features is establish school-wide expectations and define those expectations for all areas and activities. In alternative programs, you may have to consider not only the school program, but also the residential program or the non-school program, if it's a day school program, the treatment programs, the case management programs, the recreation programs. So the first thing you've got to decide is, are you implementing PBIS school-wide or facility-wide? If you're implementing school-wide, that's fine. Just always try to keep your facility colleagues involved. Invite them to be on the team and share your data and your successes with them. If you're facility-wide, that's great. It's a great opportunity for consistency throughout the program. I prefer that facilities implement facility-wide. That's not always possible. And so that can be our goal, even if you're starting in one program only. As you're developing expectations and defining those for all areas, you've got to get input from all the staff who work with youth. There are lots of ways that we can do that, but even if you're not implementing facility-wide, you're still going to have to get input from facility personnel. For example, in juvenile correctional facilities, you're going to have to get input on expectations from the correctional staff. They're the ones who interact with youth on a day-to-day basis. Think about all of the rules and expectations that are embedded within treatment programs within your program, or within other behavior management programs. For example, in residential programs, each dorm sometimes has their own behavior management system in place. You really need to think about all of the expectations that are in place locally throughout your program and have discussions about how are those going to be addressed in your master teaching matrix or matrices. And in my experience, especially in disciplinary settings, the PBIS focus on observable behaviors takes some time. A lot of people are not experienced with putting your focus on expectations that define behaviors that you can see, rather than, constructs like, so for example, we take a construct, a large overarching construct like be responsible, and we say, what does that mean in transitions? What does that mean in the day room? What does that mean in the classroom? What does that mean in the cafeteria? What does that mean in med lines? And when we're defining what it means to be responsible in all of those settings, we use words that describe behaviors that you can see. So that helps with consistency, that helps with consistency across staff, that helps with consistency from one day to the next in enforcing those expectations. But that may be something that you have to work on with your staff to focus on those observable behaviors. We use teaching matrices just like we do in school settings. Here's a couple of examples. You see this was a residential program. Their overarching expectations, they had 5 overarching expectations, and here's how they defined those expectations during wake up and hygiene routines in the morning. This is a county level juvenile detention facility. They have 3 overarching expectations, and they had one set of one entry in their teaching matrix for everywhere throughout the facility. And then they had specific expectations for safety, responsibility, and respect for day rooms and the bedrooms and outside and off unit and in school. Now, what you don't see in this slide is how many passes it took, how many iterations we went through to get to these final products. Spend some time on this. Spend the time that is needed to get to clearly defined, observable behaviors in all areas of the program, because this will be the core for everything else that you do. So it's worth the time that it takes to get this piece right. By the way, I also don't recommend making big fancy signs and expensive signs, because this should be a living document. This should be something that you revisit as your data suggest other behaviors that need to be addressed, for example. So after we establish our expectations, we have to have plans for teaching those expectations. That's another responsibility of the PBIS leadership team. In alternative facilities, and especially in juvenile justice programs, staff, day-to-day staff, may not be trained in active, direct teaching techniques. We have to, teach the staff that talking is not teaching. And there's a lot of talking to kids about their behavior, but there's less active teaching. I always use the analogy, if someone talked to me about speaking Italian, I would be strongly motivated to speak Italian. I'd really want to do that. I'd want to be able to do that all the time, but I don't know how to speak Italian, so I can't do that. So the teaching part comes in when you would teach me the words and the grammar and the vocabulary of Italian. And consequences are typically not effective teaching. If consequences were effective teaching techniques for these kids, they wouldn't be where they are in disciplinary alternative settings. So we have to maybe help our staff learn how to use direct active teaching techniques. We use a lot of different approaches to that. When I'm working with staff in alternative settings, I set out the goals. Here's what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to have teaching interactions that, for example, provide explanation about how to perform this skill, provide examples and non-examples, maybe demonstrate what those look like, have some practice activities for the youth, and then the team figures out what that will look like for their staff and how they will be able to accomplish that. Okay, so another core feature is acknowledging positive behavior. Again, staff may be unfamiliar with some of the basic foundational principles that are behind this acknowledgement of positive behavior. They may not be familiar with, for example, choosing incentives that are free or low cost, or that are oriented towards improving quality of life or skill building skills that students need. In residential programs of all types, incentive systems may be tied to level systems, and level systems tend to have their own built-in incentives. So you've got to align those programs and figure out how they're going to work together. We're going to be talking about that in the PBIS forum in October, so I'll talk more about that in a second. So we use all kinds of incentive systems. Again, when I'm working with staff in alternative programs, I tend to describe our goals, what we're trying to accomplish with these incentive systems. And then I let the staff or the PBIS leadership team come up with their form that they're going to use. This particular program used a kind of a bingo type approach. This is based off the Bill Jensen's Principles 200 Club. And so there were group incentives built in as well as individual incentives in this one system. In this same program, or in the same state in a different facility, we did a pilot. We started working facility-wide with a pilot in one dorm. And I talked to the staff about what our goals are for the incentive system. And the dorm staff came up with these incentives. And you notice that these are high value for, or these were high value for the youth. They are, many of them are free or low cost. This was a girls' dorm. They actually got input from the girls about what they would like to see in their Cougar Cash store. By the way, the get out of jail free card is not a get out of jail free as we typically think of it. It's a erase one minor infraction from your in-house record. The use of the flat iron was so popular that they ended up buying a second flat iron so that more girls could take advantage of that. This was the token that they used in their dorm. The facility-wide expectations were listed. The staff wrote the youth's name on the Cougar Cash. The staff signed it and dated it. Because this is considered a contraband item, the girls could not carry those or keep those, couldn't keep them on their person. So the staff would hand the Cougar Cash to the girls would take it over and drop it in a secure locked box. The overnight staff would then count the Cougar Cash, record how much Cougar Cash each girl had in their account. They would also note Cougar Cash being given for which expectations and by which staff. That gave us a lot of data to work with if problems started arising or we needed to look at where we could enhance use of Cougar Cash. They also included some team items where girls could pool their cash and purchase a group incentive. In terms of the systems to support PBIS, in residential programs, especially getting the team together, the team's got to be representative of all shifts throughout the 24/7 services. And getting the team together may not be possible. So you're going to have to figure out how you accomplish the goal of at least sharing information and getting input from all representatives from all roles and all staff members. Sometimes we alternate meeting times. There are various ways we accomplish that, but don't let the fact that everybody can't be in one place at one time stop you from having a representative team. Training content may be different, need to be differentiated. We talked about that alignment in terms of aligning PBIS with other treatment or behavior management programs. And in my experience, staff, especially in juvenile justice programs, need a little more support. These are not educators. These are not people who have had education training. So some of these concepts and practices are pretty new and novel to them. And so we spend more time in helping staff learn how to use these practices. In the girls program that I've worked with, we did video modeling in terms of how to recognize appropriate behavior. We wrote little scripts that the staff carried on their lanyards, and they read these verbatim for a while. We also provided PBIS expectations for staff. Expectation or possible adaptations that you may need in terms of data. Alternative programs tend to collect a lot of data. It tends to be mostly for accountability purposes, for their own reporting. It's less so to guide immediate program decisions and less so to monitor changes in positive behavior. So I always talk to programs about collecting, of course, data that reflect change in youth behavior, change in youth misbehavior, rule infractions, but also changes in the use of disciplinary actions, like room time, for example. And you also need to decide how can you capture improvements in positive behavior, maybe increases in school attendance or increases in levels if in programs that have level systems. In residential programs, staff sometimes respond to minor misbehaviors with like a write-up where they describe the incident. In those cases, I like to spend some time helping staff focus on observable behaviors and the environmental context that might be contributing to those behaviors, the antecedents and the immediate consequences, so we can start maybe getting a better understanding of when and where and why those behaviors are occurring. And finally, another issue is that access to data in alternative programs is not always easy. They often don't have a data system that provides graphed reports, for example. So the extent to which you can do that, create a system that produces graph reports will make data management and data review much easier. I know a lot of alternative programs are using Swiss, and that's great, except Swiss does require some modifications if you're going to use it, especially if you're using it in a residential program. And I wanted to now chat just for a minute about some of the modifications or adjustments that may be needed if you're a coach for alternative settings. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of learning about the program that you are supporting. The main complaint that I have gotten over the years when I've had grants to hire people to work for me to go out and work in and support PBIS and alternative programs is that the people supporting the program don't understand their program. So get to know the program, go out and visit the program and spend time in all areas, sit in on treatment groups if you're allowed, sit in the classrooms, go early in the morning, go on the weekend, go visit all the parts of the program that you're allowed, because that will help you get a better understanding of what staff are dealing with. Be flexible. PBIS is going to, the essential components are going to be there. They may look a little different than in typical schools. Coaching may take some more time. There's some foundational principles and practices that you may need to spend more time with. Remember to always focus on the overarching principles and goals. What are you trying to accomplish and why? And I always build into my training just some training in some of those foundational principles, like, what is reinforcement and how do we know if reinforcement is working? And we do that in terms that are not off-putting to staff, and it really helps them be more effective in their use of the PBIS systems. We have resources for you if you are working with PBIS in alternative settings. Our resource library, if you will, is not where I want it to be. It is growing. We are building it slowly. But if you go to PBIS.org, the website of the PBIS Technical Assistance Center, and you go to the topics menu, pull down that menu and click on Juvenile Justice. It will take you to the Juvenile Justice page where you can find tools and presentations and webinars. that are available for download through the webinars aren't available for download, but all the other tools are available for download. The webinars can be viewed on the PBIS website. You can also find materials from I think it's the last 2 years of Juvenile Justice Strand, Alternative School Strand presentations from the PBIS Forum. So those are always uploaded to the PBIS website. And speaking of the forum, our 2021 forum will be virtual again this year, which makes it nicely accessible to lots of people. It's October 26th, 27th, and 28th. The Juvenile Justice Strand will be on, I think it's Wednesday, October 27th. We have 3 sessions that really focus on implementation of Tier 1 and alignment of practices across different programs in alternative settings. And at the end of the day, we're going to have a discussion about level systems in alternative practices, some of the issues that you might encounter in terms of aligning level systems with PBIS. So come join us and bring your partners from alternative programs. I think it will be a good event that provides lots of helpful information for you. Another tool that I want to bring your attention to is the facility-wide tiered fidelity inventory. You may be familiar with the school-wide tiered fidelity inventory. Sometimes we call it the TFI. That is widely used in typical school settings. We have adapted the school-wide TFI for facility-wide use. So for use in alternative programs, either day programs or residential programs. We spent about 2 years adapting that instrument and field testing it and piloting it in alternative settings of all types around the country. We took their input, made adjustments in terminology and scoring criteria and so forth. And this is the new version. If you use the TFI and have input for me about how to improve it for alternative settings, I welcome your feedback on that. Also, if you are using the TFI on an annual or more often basis to monitor fidelity of implementation in your alternative program, we have a beta version of an Excel template for entering TFI scores, for entering TFI data, and the template will then produce the graphs for your TFI scores, which may be very helpful for you. If you would like to try that template, I'd be happy to share it with you. And eventually that will be placed on the PBIS website and available for use, but you can access it now if you would like. The TFI, again, is a way of evaluating or monitoring fidelity of implementation of PBIS in alternative settings. It has sections that address the essential features in Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. It provides descriptions of each essential feature and scoring criteria. This is a self-scoring process usually, although I like to recommend that you include someone from outside your program, and someone who knows your program and knows PBIS. Sometimes that outside input is helpful. So the goal is not to get the highest score possible. The goal is accurate self-reflection on your PBIS activities. That will then help you in your action planning as you move forward and are either moving towards implementation of Tier 1 or perhaps Tier 2 or even Tier 3, or as you're just improving implementation of Tier 1, Tier 2, or Tier 3. Before I go on to this next section, Catherine, I have not been monitoring the chat. Do we have any chat items that we need to address at this moment?
Sure. We do have one point that Matt Bell wanted to kind of have us further elaborate on, and that was the distinction in how the PBIS structure would work for a long-term versus a short-term alternative school setting.
Okay, and Matt, I assume this might be a day school program, but I'm going to address it both ways. There's really not a lot of difference. In fact, I would say the major differences are in short-term settings, where children are in the setting for only a few days or a few weeks. Longer term, you have time to really establish your systems and your data and your practices and have those be meaningful over time. Most of the programs that I work with are long-term, residential, and alternative programs. The one issue in disciplinary alternative settings that I like to talk about with staff is, what are the exit criteria for your program? How do youth get out of your program? Sometimes they have to just complete a certain number of days. Sometimes it's tied to other criteria, like their behavior in the program. So if that's the case, if it's tied to behavior in the program, I want to be sure that your PBIS systems, like your expectations and your teaching activities and your acknowledgement systems, are addressing those criteria that are important for youth to exit your program. And I hope that helps. In shorter term facilities and programs, you have different issues in terms of data, in terms of incentives. Incentives must be much shorter based. In terms of your expectations, you're probably not going to have as in-depth a teaching matrix as you might in a long-term facility. You're probably going to spend more time teaching expected behavior. So if you have any specific questions that my response didn't address, go ahead and email me, and I'm happy to address that. Catherine, are there any other questions that we need to address?
That is all for the moment. We can move forward.
Excellent. Okay, so I want to talk for a minute about, it's not an alternative setting, but it's an alternative application, if you will, of PBIS. And this is, by the way, in part how Catherine and I came to work together. She has been working with me on a project in which we applied the PBIS systems, or sort of a PBIS light framework, to school policing. Like it or not, agree with it or not, school resource officers are a fixture in most typical schools today, most secondary typical schools today. There's mixed data about the presence of school resource officers. There is agreement on some concerns. One concern is that there's not consistency or necessarily agreement about what are the roles of the school resource officers. Sometimes even the school resource officers aren't clear on what their roles should be in the school. Most school resource officer programs have a pretty clear distinction that SROs are not to be involved in school discipline matters, but that is not necessarily true in every system. Another issue is that there's not a lot of communication sometimes between the school resource officer and the school administration, or at least not purposeful, goal-driven communication. And another concern is lack of systematic or data-based goal planning and monitoring of progress towards those goals. So in 2016, I was awarded a nice grant from the National Institute of Justice, which is a division of the Department of Justice, the U.S. Department of Justice, to allow me to evaluate the effects of a PBIS type framework in terms of school resource officers. We are in our final year of the project now. We're analyzing all of our data. The project, we worked with 6 school districts in Central Texas, 25 secondary schools, middle schools, and high schools, which were randomly assigned to either the treatment group or a control group. The treatment group got the PBIS framework and coaching and other forms of support. The control group's business as usual. We provided no PBIS support or interventions. And then we addressed the impact across multiple variables. The framework that we implemented were, first, we provided training for all of the officers, got 20 hours of training that addressed the developmental needs of children in schools. In that training was a section on PBIS, restorative practices, mental health needs of adolescents, and other child-oriented topics. We also provided training for the educators in the schools where we worked. Each school set up a representative team consisting of educators. The SRO was a member of the team. Many of the schools had student representatives and community representatives. Each school established measurable goals that they wanted to address. They developed activities to achieve those goals, and the goals needed to relate to school safety and climate, and the activities needed to involve, to some extent, the SRO. And then we collected lots of types of data. The framework, site-based law enforcement framework, as we called it, is now that we used was there's a handbook that we gave to each school. That handbook is now being revised. It will be available on the Texas School Safety Center website by the end of this year. If you're interested in it and want to know more about it, and at the end of the year and you can't find it, email me and I'll direct you to it. This is an example of a goal that was set by a high school and their data source that they used to measure progress towards that goal. The data sources, they looked at disciplinary referrals for e-cigarette use and a student survey just to see what students felt about the issue. That particular school implemented a lot of policies to address the use of e-cigarettes. The activities included education about e-cigarettes, new procedures. Because e-cigarettes were mostly used in the restrooms, they established new procedures about that restroom use. They increased supervision, and they also had students develop and produce and film and star in and do every aspect of videos that were educational videos that were shared not only at the high school, but at the middle school as well. And then for the project overall, we have gathered state-reported discipline data from all of these campuses, student surveys of climate and safety in their school. We gathered reports of officer reports of encounters with students. We did interviews with the administrator of each school and the officer at each school and asked them about how they interact with youth, how they manage behavior, what proactive techniques they use, and their perceptions of the framework components. And then we also assessed fidelity of implementation across all parts of our project. What we're seeing so far is that SROs and administrators report really liking the communication that's built into the framework. There's a better understanding of what SROs do, what their role is on campus. One of the things that's most exciting to me from a PBIS perspective is that from the interviews and from the officer encounter logs, what we found is that officers are already engaging in practices that reflect positive behavior supports, Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3. And so it makes perfect sense to bring school resource officers into your PBIS activities because they want to be proactive. They want to provide support for students who are at risk for mental health challenges or behavioral challenges. They want to play a role other than just someone who responds to criminal infractions. So I encourage you, even if you're not running a big project like this, bring your school resource officer into your PBIS team. If he or she can't be a regular part of the team, make your school resource officer an ad hoc member. Communicate with them about your PBIS activities. Some of our campuses were actively implementing all aspects of PBIS, and they would give the school resource officer their PBIS tokens, for example, to distribute during his walks through the hall or through the cafeteria. So make your school resource officer at least aware of PBIS and preferably an active participant in your PBIS activities. And there we go. So, and consider how you might use your SROs in your Tier 2 and Tier 3 planning, even in alternative programs. Many alternative programs have correctional officers or disciplinary officers that can play roles in supporting children who have greater need. And I've got that my clock is showing it's the end of our regularly scheduled webinar time. We have some time for practices, I'm not making any sense. We have some time for questions now. If you have questions that you'd like to pose after the webinar ends, Here's my email address. I check it frequently, and I will get back to you as soon as I possibly can. By the way, in terms of resources, I'm doing a lot of active support for alternative programs right now. I'm running a monthly community of practice for a few alternative programs. I'm doing some training for alternative programs. So there's a lot going on. If there's anything I can do to support your efforts in implementing PBIS or in supporting PBIS in alternative programs, just let me know. Catherine, do you see any other questions or comments? Does anyone have questions or comments?
So some of the major comments we've been seeing is that people are really responding to this presentation. They're very excited about the content. So they're anxious to receive that handout, which we've already sent the link. You can find that link in the chat so that you can take a look at everything we've talked about today. And as far as the actual recording of today's presentation, it will be available in about 3 weeks' time once everything has been perfected and is able to be uploaded onto the PBIS website. We do have an additional comment here from James Pointer, and I'm just going to kind of read what we have, what James wrote. He said, as an SRO and the president of the Kentucky Association of School Resource Officers, he wanted to invite everyone to visit and see what they're doing. They're doing a lot of the things that have been mentioned today and so much more already. And their SROs receive 40 hours of training every year. Additionally, 120 hours are required within 3 years. So looks like they're already making some great headway with many of the things we've been looking at in our grant.
Excellent. James, if you have any links that you could send me, I'd love to see more about what you're doing. And thanks for sharing that. By the way, as Catherine said, the webinar will be available in about 3 weeks. If you go to pbis.org and you're not able to find the webinar, just email me and I'll track it down for you.
Yes, it looks like you will have to check the website first and foremost. There won't be, the recording won't be directly emailed, but as Dr. Sherman just said, she would be happy to send it your way if you have any trouble.
Well, I am really passionate about extending these positive, proactive, evidence-based, data-driven practices into alternative programs, especially disciplinary programs, because a program can be a disciplinary program and still be focus on prevention and focus on teaching new skills and enhancing students' repertoire of positive behaviors. We're learning a lot. We have learned a lot about PBIS in alternative settings. If you have any questions or would like to chat or tell me what great things you're doing with PBIS and alternative programs, please get in touch with me. I would love to hear from you. So if there are no other questions or comments, I will say thank you, and I look forward to crossing paths with you in the future. Thank you for coming and joining us today.